welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's session is going to be a hybrid session. It's our first hybrid session. So if you're having any audio issues, please let us know in the chat. You may need to raise your volume. We are testing out a new audio system, so you're our guinea pigs today. But we want to thank you for being here today for our webinar led by Chaitra Powell from UNC Chapel Hill Libraries. And first, before we get started, we would like to acknowledge our funders. Today's session is funded through the Library Services and Technology Act, provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and administered through the Florida Department of State Division of Library and Information Services. So we'd like to thank them for their support of our programming today. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to our speaker today, Chaitra Powell.
Cool. This is how it goes. And so I thought it would be important to just talk for a minute about why we use the term community-driven instead of community archives outright. And, you know, for me, having a background in community archives, I just wanted to be clear that this is not, there's no way that an institution like UNC can be a community archive, and we didn't want to obscure the work that those groups are already doing. And so for us, community-driven just means that communities are the major stakeholder that's driving our decision-making. And it's not just about giving things to communities, whether it's backpacks or trainings, and it's not just about collecting materials from communities, whether it's some initiative to diversify our collections. And it's not just asking communities to help us solve our problems or bringing them in to help us address some of our longstanding challenges. And so I want to say that community-driven archives is more than the sum of its parts. So even though we do these things in different ways, it's not one thing exclusively. For me, it actually requires us to consider the superiority of communities and their memory work. It requires us to pay attention and think about what we can learn and potentially apply to our work. And so throughout our presentation, I really want to keep honing in on getting very specific and thinking about what communities actually have to offer us and thinking about it from a strengths-based place and not community service. This work, if you frame it as community service, you're like guaranteed to fail. Like, we really need to think about ourselves as equal partners with equally important things to give to projects. And so I have this quote from this article that I read about essentially African-American digital humanities projects. But in the article, the scholar Jessica Marie Johnson talks about genealogists and community archives and thinking about the actual lived experiences of African-Americans and how that could be a factor in the archival work and the digital databases that we're working on. And so how do you put the actual lived experiences of these people in conversation with the archives? And in the quote, she talks about how do Black people make their humanity their legal and extra-legal exclusion and form new worlds, creating inclusive and equitable social conditions. And this is so much of what we want to do in the library and in the university. And if these communities are already doing it, I think we really have to take a minute to think about how that's possible and what we can learn from it. Okay. All right. So, cool. So I wanted to share this example to just help us get at the importance of being specific. And I always like to just share resources with people because you never know when people are looking for a new podcast. So Amanda Seales is an actress, and she has this podcast called Small Doses. And in one, she talks about, she has a film critic on there, and they're talking about all these different movies. And they're doing a review of this Netflix movie called Uncorked, which is really interesting. It's funny and it's heartwarming. But in the movie, the main character is from Memphis, Tennessee. His father is owns a barbecue restaurant, and he decides that he wants to be a sommelier. And his dad just can't understand why he doesn't want to be a barbecue man. And he's like in Paris, learning about wines and taking all these exams. So it is very, very specific. Like, those are very specific things. But in the end, the critic said something that just, I can't forget it. He says, the more specific you are, it actually leads to universal truths. So a universal truth about fathers and sons. And what does it mean when you want to break out from what your father wants to do? And so it's really inspirational for me to think about, what does it mean to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina at Wilson Special Collections Library, myself in this role, and what conclusions do I find? And I think that everyone, for whatever context they're in, has an opportunity to think about what should come from their work, what their community engagement looks like. And so that's just kind of a precursor to this, this idea that this is not like 10 easy steps, how to reach hard to reach communities, that this work is hyper-specific. It's very much relative to our own context. And it's not always great for grant work or even presentations. Like, it's really the nitty-gritty of it all. And so this is just Gil Scott-Heron being cool. And in this great song / poem, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," he talks about, what it means for systems to be upended, for things to happen. It almost has to be subversive in a way, because power doesn't really concede. And so it's just a reminder that the work isn't always aligned with the pretty things of outreach and the photo op and the grant project and going to the next thing. It can be more complicated than that. So I know a lot of folks are familiar with UNC in 2020. Our libraries did a book club where we all read How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And it was really good to have a book that could respond to, the whole state of the world in 2020 in terms of racial injustice and George Floyd, and how are the libraries part of systems that are complicit in this anti-Black racism. But my main takeaway from the book was to really think about policies and to try to get away from, trying to help people actually respect each other, or try to, make people feel bad about being racist. Like, it really doesn't matter. We work for institutions. Institutions can implement policies that can either help or hinder this progress towards racial equity. And so Ibram Kendi has this book, and literally at the end, he talks about these steps, and he uses it for his center in the American University. But I think that it just spoke to me, like, if our collection is 90% white in the Southern Historical Collection, and we're not blaming Black people for not giving us their stuff, how do we understand why we are not the place? If we say we care about the South, this is not really reflecting the truth of the South. What can we do differently to attract those collections or to engage those communities differently? And so you can kind of go through these steps for any kind of inequity that you see in your work. And so all of this is just kind of an introduction to the ways that I'm trying to think about our work, being specific, thinking about policies, and not being confined to the research life cycle or the grant life cycle that fits nicely into these little pockets of libraries. So to follow my own advice, I do want to tell folks a little bit about the institution that I work for. And so at UNC Chapel Hill, we have a very large collection that describes the American South. We are founded in 1930, so being over 90 years old, we have quite a few collections. The original curator is pictured by his Model T board there. And if you can imagine, in 1930, there weren't as many, like UNC is one of the oldest colleges and have old libraries. And nobody was interested in these records that were all over the American South. And so he took it upon himself, because of his own beliefs that the South was this amazing place. he literally traveled around collecting things. They called him Ransack. And everything came back to Chapel Hill. And they were essentially records that would talk about white businessmen, white scholars, plantation families, but really to laud them and appreciate their contributions. And a lot of the records, specifically of African Americans, specifically of formerly enslaved people, were a part of the collections, but that's not the reason they were collected. And so we have to do a lot of excavation work in our description to find those lives. And so, we start as essentially a Civil War collection, an antebellum collection. As we move into the 60s and 70s, we do have more political and social change kind of papers. And then, we do have African American materials, but it's not the bulk. I think our number one subject heading is Confederate States of America. And so it's going to take a lot to make it balanced. So, yes, okay. And then also to acknowledge the context of these collections come with wealthy donors who set up the endowments and encourage the use and build up the power and reputation of the collection. And so we sit on all of this. And so what does it mean for us to try to go in a different direction? Okay. And lots of people have gone in different directions, but then here I come in 2014. And my experience was almost exclusively in Black-owned spaces. And so the Mamie Clayton Library and Museum was the place I was at before coming to UNC. It's based in Los Angeles, California, and it's essentially a community archive. One woman collected over 1 million items related to African American history. She kept them in her house. When they were bursting out of the house, she was able to find a decommissioned courthouse for the materials to reside. And it became a community center for local folks. Lots of literally archival processing, like we were cataloging photos, we did programs and events. And so for me, there was such it was interesting to try to come to a college where there's this like hyper division of labor, a department for collecting, a department for processing. When at this museum, whoever was available did work. It was not this, it was just different. So, and so I'm bringing this kind of background to this job, which is officially African American Collections and Outreach Archivist in the Southern Historical Collection. And I really struggled with trying to convince people to give their materials to UNC when we had this really complicated history. And also thinking about positionality, where folks might feel comfortable with me, but I'm representing this university that's representing the state. That is not a place that they want to be a part of. And so for me, it was really easy to think about, well, we're not going to cajole people to bring stuff here. How do we support them in developing their community archives wherever they are? And so I bring this up because it really gets at the specificity. And I feel like it's important to talk about community being a very specific thing. Sometimes I talk about as if like there are only the papers of white racists in the Southern Historical Collection and all the African American materials are scattered in the, it's not true. There's nothing inherently good or bad about universities or community archives. It's all in the activation. And I would say that communities are not only defined by race, even within race, there are distinctions and erasures. And my point about the way I do focus on African American collections because very specifically the role of chattel slavery in our region, in our university, and the collection just gives it a more weight in this region. And so I think about other painful histories and intersections. But I just thought, like when I saw this performance at the Super Bowl, I was like, there's so many layers of community in this performance. Like they're in Inglewood, California, where this West Coast rapping thing happened. They are wearing these Dickies, they're wearing these blue colors for these gangs that are actually, if you read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, She talks about how a lot of Black people migrated from Mississippi and Louisiana, like running from the Klan, and that they have these kind of rebellious spirits that actually could be seen as a foundation for some of these like Crips and Bloods and street gangs that came up in the 70s and 80s. And so, you know, when we talk about communities, there is a way that they dress, there is a music that they listen to, there is a way that they talk that makes them very specific. And I'm just really interested in that because there are so many like broad narratives, especially about like African-American communities. Like we're working with the African-American community, but it's like, are you working with church ladies? Are you working with Muslims? Are you working with young people? Are you working with older people? And so, and all of those things would present different values. And I feel like communities know who they are better than we do. And so to see someone express community in this way with their clothes and their culture, it just helps you know that it exists if you care enough. I mean, this is like commercial and exciting, but I believe it exists in the communities that surround us. All right, so I'm going to try to move through the timeline of our grant really quickly so that you'll also have some context of my experience before we talk about more reflections. But in 2017, the Society of American Archivists had a conference in Portland that talked about liberated archives, community archives. And I feel like that was a really big touch point for a lot of institutions to start thinking about community archives and thinking about how they do or don't engage with them. Like I said, I started in 2014 talking about community archives, but it was a big deal in 2017. And then our grant came together in 2017. And we really like focused on community archives methodology. And we also wanted to kind of tie a string around all the communities that we're already working with. How could this grant give us more resources to help them get what they needed? So yeah, we got this major grant and I'll tell you a little bit about it. So we have these 4 pilot communities. And like I said, these relationships go back decades. Like we've known these people since 2012. And normally they would give their papers to the collection, but we didn't have capacity to help them with some of their signature projects. And so just going through the signature deliverables for the Student Health Coalition, we built them a website. For the Eastern Kentucky African American Migration Project, we developed a traveling exhibition for them. For Historically Black Towns and Settlements Alliance, which was like actually 8 partners, we did a lot of training and resource development with them. And then for the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, we supported them in standing up an independent community archive. And so it was essentially a punch list. Like these folks knew what they wanted, and we put all of those things into the grant and we executed it. So it's pretty straightforward, the work that we did with these folks. At the midpoint, amid some like shakeups in our staff, and my own question about this distance, you know, like when I was with them, maybe Clayton, it was like, I met those people every day. I was working with them on their collections. But the way that the grant went, we were just so spread out geographically. And we also had kind of a system of community champions, like people who knew the university and knew the community, and they were like kind of translating for us and kind of, you know, helping us communicate this work. But it made me wonder, like, what if you were just like a random resident in Grambling? Could you still pick up the tools? Could you still care about this work? And so working with the champions, we tried to just extend it out a ring. And we were also thinking about the stories that people wanted to tell. Community champions can be gatekeepers in their own way, where they're representing this community, but whatever their pet project is, it's not necessarily what everyone cares about. And so between our outreach and working with the community champions, we identified a cohort of 10 people that were from our pilot communities, but had separate interests and separate identities. And so the distribution kind of shook out with that outer ring. So we had the most folks from Historically Black Towns, and then 2 people from each of the other communities. But altogether, the 10 of them were given a stipend, so just cash that they could use however they wanted. They were given an archivist in a backpack toolkit. And we asked them to think about what is the story that they want to tell? What is the container for that story? Is it in the photos? Is it in the oral histories? What is the sharing mechanism for it? Are you going to make a digital website for it? Are you going to do a community project or event? How will anybody know what you collected or identified? And then what is the long-term preservation plan for the thing that you found? And so it was very much process over product, where we wanted them to, if you just did one oral history, shared it at your family reunion, and planned to deposit it in the public library, then you fulfilled the requirement. And then they also had a series of trainings throughout it's 18 months and a couple keystone events. And so that became a part of our grant too. So we had the big communities, the seedlings. I've been alluding to this backpack. This was a part of the big community. We use them with the communities, and we also use it for the seedlings. But from the very beginning, we just understood that sometimes people just need tools to get started. And so we built these backpacks. There was an oral history one, is the backpack, and the rolling kit was the scanner bag. And so it was very just, you got stuff you want to scan, you got people you want to record, and there are some tools. So I'll talk more about that in a minute, but it was pretty compelling and it was a nice soundbite, but I'll talk more about it at the end. Let's see. And towards the end, we did develop this web-based toolkit where everything that we used for the grant, we plugged it on the site so people could find things. They could find templates, they could find the question cards for the oral histories. There's a lot of reflective blogs in there. So if you're more curious about the stories of those communities, they're out there. It's a really nice way to kind of encapsulate the work that we did. And it's a resource for us going forward. So I know I zoomed through that really quickly, but there's been so much written about our grant project, and the website has a lot of tools. And I can answer any questions that you might have, but that was essentially our grant. And let me talk a little bit about what we learned. Okay, so I should say that the last set, we had a few turnovers across the grant between graduate students and staff positions, but the last set of folks on the team really did an extraordinary job in composting our work, which is a term that my colleague really shared with me. Whatever, it's composting. But it makes sense because, good or bad, we are taking our experiences and we're trying to use it as fertile ground to do something. We don't want this work to just sit on a shelf of one day we did that thing and then everything that comes after it has nothing to do with that thing. So we did a lot to write about our work, talk about it with colleagues, and try to synthesize it into concrete steps for moving forward. And so, between 2017 and 2021, we distributed about 70 backpack kits across the region. And there's no telling if they're sitting in a corner somewhere that no one's using, or if they've actually been used to generate stuff. We didn't require people to show us how it's going. And yeah, that kind of, I don't know, we just felt like we could do more. And so in terms of our reflection on the backpack, it was designed as a tool, but I think it actually served as more of a symbol. It's a thing to get you started, help demystify the process. And then there was just so many resource disparities. There were a few communities who were able to kind of get in a rhythm, but we were their repository. So all they had to do was just give it to us, and then it became part of their collections. But the folks in these rural areas that didn't have as much of a relationship with us, we would talk about digital preservation and like, here's some hard drives and how you might want to label things and, you know, give it a try, but they just didn't have the guardrails to help maintain digital files for the long term. So that's a thing that we have to acknowledge. As I said earlier, they were just scanning or oral history. And the more that we work with people, we saw that folks also have history in places. Like they're talking about the old segregated school, and they wonder what they can do to preserve that or talk about that. They also had three-dimensional objects, like things that they wanted to preserve in these house museums in different places. And so we work with some experts in these areas to identify two other kinds of kits to build alongside the oral history and the 2D scanning. And so now we have 4 kits that we're going to try. And then we're also hoping to build a new community of people with backpacks, because it's like a very specific kind of person that has it and the questions that they have. And so, you know, what would it look like if there was a monthly session for folks with the kits to come get advice on the technology, share their stories about what's working and what's not. So all that to say, this summer, we're kind of standing up this Archivist in a Backpack 2.0 with these new kits that are available. And I have a project coordinator that's going to be coordinating some of this work throughout the year. So we can see if we can do, how else this project can grow. So, and then we also got a grant to build these new kits. So that's my staff building kits. The other thing that we try to explore with the post-grant context. So, you know, we had almost $1 million for the Mellon Foundation. We had 5 staff people, 2 graduate students that were really trying to churn out all of this work. And so when March 2021 hit and all of those people and that money disappear, and we have all of our normal jobs plus this, like, what's reasonable to keep going. And so I did have a very brave graduate student who was like, I think we know a community. Let's try to engage them and see how much of our grant approach would work. Not very much of it works. These folks are amazing. They're from Stokes County, North Carolina. They gather around a Rosenwald school in their community. And they're really interested in oral history. People are getting older and they need their stories recorded. But we didn't have the staff that could go out there and record those things. We talked about like maybe the backpack would be cool for like a high school student or someone who has like some time to learn about it and then like record people in their community. But we couldn't quite get it together, like the triangulation of like our resource, the you know, passionate local history people, and the actual like folks who do the work. Like we just couldn't get it all together. And so, and we didn't have any incentives. There was no seedling money to give to people to take on learning about oral history. And so there was a big question about labor. And I actually got like really uncomfortable sometimes where we would just be in a meeting like, okay, who's gonna do that? And you know, those community stakeholders were very clear, like they're either don't want to engage with technology in that way or just don't have the time in their own lives. So we wrote a blog about it, but just with transparency, because at the same time, you know, I think librarians kind of have a culture of like, we'll figure it out, we'll find a way to like make this work, but that's not always sustainable. And so we had to just like respectfully back out of that conversation and just kind of keep them in mind as more opportunities come up. And so I think that's important because there's just no guarantee that it will make sense every time. Another thing, and we're gonna try to explore this a little bit in the workshop, but me and some of my grant team members were trying to identify some themes from our work, and we wanted to engage those themes with our special collections colleagues. And there are just so many tensions. This is what I was just getting at, the idea that you have to say no to work that's beyond your capacity, but you also have to be flexible, because if you're just saying, I mean, I feel this way, like every day if somebody asks me for something, I'm like, no, it's beyond my capacity. But like, that's no way to grow if you're not willing to explore what people need and how, you know, how to even, I don't know, do different work. Like if you're always just swamped and overburdened. So those two things seem incompatible. The same thing in libraries, this idea of like backlogs and like existing work. I mean, this is it's essentially saying this, the first one and the second one are very much related. But working with communities represents a new form of work. And so how can you, honestly take on new work when there's all this old work waiting? Number 3 is kind of what came up. So for us at UNC Libraries, we talked a lot about reckoning. Like that was the big umbrella for the anti-racism training, for, conscious editing and all these different kind of more progressive things we wanted to do. But it's almost like we're trying to fix ourselves, but we're also asking communities to help fix us. Like what should come first? And, I usually err on the side of like institutional reckoning work, that there's actually more that we could be doing as librarians, as staff members, than just like bringing more people into it. But it's a tension because people are clearly still doing community outreach as grant projects and as projects, but we'll get into it more with some of just the systems that we're questioning and how do we complicate it by inviting more people into it. And then the 4th one is really kind of important to me as a collector, because we talk a lot about extraction being a really bad thing. Like, we're not going to just go around the South sucking up all these collections, devoiding them of their context, stealing them from communities. They don't belong here. Stop extracting things. It's violent. But at the same time, there's a privilege in being able to drop off your materials to Wilson Library in Chapel Hill. They're not in your attic. They're available for researchers. Your descendants will have access to them, and you literally just go about your life. You do not have to worry about becoming a citizen archivist or trying to build a community archive because of power dynamics. And so, being excluded from the archive, I think, is another form of violence, especially when it's state-funded resources that your material could be here, could be cared for. And so I really try to hone in on that, because I think in the early days when we would talk about community archives, a lot of staff people were just like, oh, it's not coming here. Like, that's not our issue. Like, it doesn't matter to us. But in a lot of ways, we have to prepare ourselves for when those collections could come here. And we have to like build foundations where people could actually feel comfortable bringing their materials to us, because it's a huge resource that should be available to more diverse communities. Okay, so we did talk a lot about this in all these different ways, and I'll share all the links with you all later, but we spent a lot of time just thinking critically and writing about our experiences. And so I kind of have this like laundry list of things that I think is kind of liberating in terms of, community-driven archives doesn't just happen in the curatorial unit of an archives. It happens in everything that the libraries touch. And so I have these 3 slides that are just going to talk about our reflections on our grant, what we imagine going forward, and then some other ideas that didn't fit into those 2 categories. So, just looking back at our grant and some of the surveys that we did, communities were empowered. So our work was to try to identify a spectrum of options where it's like, you could build a community archive, you could donate to the Southern Historical Collection, and there are like 12 other things that you could do in the middle. And so they can make an informed decision about what to do with their materials. Our staff was diverse. We had gender non-binary folks on our team. It was led by a woman of color, that was me. And I think that has implications for library HR. How do you get more diverse people into the room, especially if you're gonna have these kinds of conversations? We talked a lot about the limitations of our institution. I think historically, we've kind of just been like, yeah, we can do it. And we would just like totally burn out every single person in the libraries trying to make impossible things happen just for someone to ask us to do it again. And it's just like, no, we're not going to keep doing this to our colleagues, specifically around like, building websites that are going to break and like no plans for saving them. So yeah, we acknowledge the limitations of our institutions. We talk a lot about the ethics of the short-term engagement and these grant life cycles and the soft money and how hard that is for the communities and our staff. We talked a lot about accessibility on our grant. So every video that we made was captioned. We tried to use best practices that the university puts forward to make our materials as accessible as possible, using alt text for images, transcribing oral histories, and things like that. Universal design, essentially. And this whole idea of the value of storytelling to complicate our historical narratives. And so it was almost like we didn't want to do all of the supportive work until we heard like, just tell us what you wish people knew, and how does that in conversation with what people think they know. And so I feel like that helped demystify it. And it's like your archive is important because it's telling a story. It's not because it's on the oldest piece of paper or because it's in the Southern Historical Collection. It's because it's a story that needs to be told. So, and that was also a big part of every community that we worked with. Like they all had an interpretive mechanism. Like none of them were satisfied that it's safe on the hard drive. Like they needed an exhibit, they needed a website, they needed some way to share it out, which is interesting. It definitely complicates how archivists imagine ourselves. Like we just keep it and then someone else interprets it, but it's like maybe we are interpreting it in the way that we keep it. So ideas for the future. So this is another thing that my colleague Kimber helped draft a blog post. And she was like, how would anyone know that an institution is actually moving in a community-driven archive framework? Maybe some of the things that we did on our grant people would do, whether it's a history harvest where we're scanning things and returning. Maybe it's these charrettes, which were these community conversations that we hosted where we asked people to think about these stories. All of these things are mentioned on our website, but if folks are implementing these things, that might be a clue that they care about community-driven archives. Thinking about programs outside of the library. I know in Chapel Hill, there is a very big like town and gown situation, and it takes a lot for folks to get to campus. So what does it mean for us to go to them? Maintaining partnerships and just like in the beginning, we thought that we would just like generate these projects and like go to the next one. But like someone told me like, never mind, I'm not gonna tell it. But anyways, the idea of partnerships are long-term. They don't just spin off when the project's over. Finding ways for grant money and institutional funds to go into the hands of community members. We wrote we had a lot of conversations about budget as morality. What does it say when like 90% of the Mellon money just went to UNC Chapel Hill in the form of our staff and our resources? How do you get more community members as independent contractors or actually like paid staff to distribute the money in a more moral way? Let's see. So we talked about clear and accessible language, which is related to a bigger project at UNC around conscious editing and reparative description. How do you allow people to search for things in the ways that they talk about things and not just like antiquated words from the Library of Congress. Let's see, content warnings and even a statement about this internal work. And so, we're doing this a lot with our records of enslavement, but it's to say, we know we have these records, we know they're problematic, and this is what we're doing to work on it. We thought that was a more genuine way of engaging than just like assuming people understand what you do and how it's problematic or how it could be problematic. So once again, like this is beyond the curatorial unit. And these are things our reference and instructional staff can do, our technical services staff can do. And I really like the way that we frame community-driven archives is like the biggest bucket possible. And it's a way of us all, because honestly, if a person comes to the library, they're not gonna meet me, like I'm gonna be in the back or like off-site somewhere. How does every staff person embody these values? Okay. And then one thing I just wanted to conclude with is talking a little bit about radical empathy, because this was such an important, point of analysis through all of our work. And it's the idea that, we can care about the people in our collections, and that's okay. We can care about ourselves, we can care about our institution, and like having space for that just moment to feel is really important. And I think our communities responded to it. And I think it helps us with the library work that we have to do on a daily basis. And I actually engaged our graduate students in this reading group twice a month, where we would reflect on our readings, kind of digest it, think about what it means to us at our very specific context. And so, Michelle Caswell, Marika Seaport, like this is very well documented, but thinking about it, what it meant for us in the SHC. And so, power dynamics unfolded with the way that in some of our antebellum collections, you knew more about the white family's horse than you knew about the Black families in the collection. And so, you can't talk about our materials without talking about the impact of power on the way that they were collected and the way that they're described. We talked about ways of knowing in terms of, so much of our collection is Black ink on white paper. And so it's like an intrinsically literate kind of way, like that's the archive. Like what if your history is an oral tradition, or if your history is in the objects or the tattoos or anything else, the ways that you keep knowledge. And so that automatically makes the archive incomplete because it's only telling the history of, one way of keeping history. The not a moral imperative kind of goes back to the Ibram Kendi thing, where we're not trying to make people feel bad, and we're not trying to like have a kumbaya moment. It's just an articulation of what we have in front of us and what the inequity is and what are our like small and big ways of addressing it. We talked a lot about belonging in community, and so back to that Jessica Marie Johnson quote about how can community be a model, a group that we can learn from, not just a group that we're trying to serve. And then belonging, where do collections belong is a huge question, whether it's at peer institutions or in community or with us, and just trying to unpack belonging. I read a really good essay about how belonging can be an antidote for human suffering and finding meaning in our experiences. And so that just feels important when you're thinking about legacies of slavery and how belonging and community have actually give you meaning in the face of that much suffering. Embodiment is a really important one because we think about what does it mean to engage with these materials on a daily basis, and how hard and traumatic that can be, and giving people space to take breaks or do other things. And also the power of place, like the soil in Chapel Hill, like so many things have happened there. And I think that impacts how we understand it. And there's almost like a disembodiment sometimes in the archive when you take a thing out of its context and put it on the shelf. Like, so, you know, trying to reconstruct those histories and engage those communities so that you actually have a truer understanding of what's in front of you feels important. And so we kind of drew on a lot of resources related to philosophy and arts and cultures, and to just think about what embodiment could mean. And the last one that we're probably going to get it wrong, and that the next generation of people will probably do it like better. Like, so try not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So iterating is a big part of our work. So there's a lot of ideas and concepts, but I really just like to keep the kind of conversation open and let people kind of take what they need from sessions like this. And I try to end on with this quote because I think it's beautiful, but the idea that it's like, if you can acknowledge all of these pitfalls and challenges and still make a connection and still like execute a project, like that's incredible and we should celebrate. And so like trying to make room for joy was like a big part of our grant project, especially with our Kentucky folks, because they were a diaspora community. And so when they came together to make something happen, there were a lot of laughs and jokes. So celebrate yourselves. All right. Oh, I think that's it. This is where all of our historically Black towns were. But do you have any questions? I'm sorry, that was a lot of talking.
So we're at our Q&A portion. If you have any questions, to our virtual audience, you can put those in the chat. If you would like to verbalize your question instead of put it in the chat, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. And then we'll also take questions from the room as well if anyone in the room has questions. We're still waiting for questions to come in online, so go ahead and ask your question.
So thank you so much, by the way. This was wonderful and incredibly insightful, and I appreciate all the anecdotes that you added along the way. So this recent article that was published, I guess, at the end of 2021, by Michelle Caswell and a group of folks that she met with from community archives, don't come correct or don't come at all. I think that was really also a great way to get the perspectives of these community archives that we often work with, but perhaps don't always feel empowered to give us their full feeling of the situation, the interaction, right? They don't feel like they are able to open up in the way that it seems like they did when they met all together. I could be wrong, but I thought some of the things that they mentioned that they all agreed on was the idea of this parachute researcher, and then in the context of us as libraries, archivists, coming in and doing this community work, and it's something that you mentioned as well, this sustained partnership. We have this interaction that may have come about through grant funding and things like that. And this is like a comment, and maybe like it's a rhetorical question because I don't know if we have the answer to it. Yeah. But maybe you have to really helpful insight to share. How do we maintain these relationships after the funding is ended? So it's not even just a matter of like maintaining the technical infrastructure and then the personnel resources that we have to maintain, but this like actual relationship with the communities that we've built over time, so they don't have the feeling that we've come in and had this like extractive relationship with them.
Right.
And I know it takes time.
Right. I know a colleague recently mentioned like moving at the speed of trust, like moving like slowly with folks. For me, I feel like it's about alignment. And I think about it a lot in terms of, you know, especially after our grant, whether we're partnering or consulting for different groups and trying to be like very explicit about what that role is. Because I feel like a consultant could like share resources, do a few trainings, and it could be like, okay, like the expectation isn't to be there forever. But a partner should really be a person or a community who, you know, maybe has the same geographical interest that you do, has the same like collecting strengths or topics that you're going to be like recurring a part, like, you know, engaging. And so, you know, like I'm also like knee deep in trying to think about collection development policies in the Southern Historical Collection. And so I felt like, you know, once we get that straight and we can say like full throated, like this is what we care about right now, like the communities that, you know, correspond to those things, like should be our partners. And that should be a very much long-term relationship. I think if you're just like scattershot all over the place, like you're gonna run out of steam to maintain those relationships. So that's one thought, but then also, I don't know, sometimes things are ephemeral, and that's probably a reality that we all accept sometimes. Yeah.
We have a question online, so I'm gonna let her unmute herself.
Hello?
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, okay. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really good, a lot of good information, took a lot of notes. And I was really interested when you started talking about extraction and inclusion, where some people may feel like, you know, you're taking it from us and they may want to keep it as opposed to sending it to the university. Well, I'm from Tampa, and we have, I work for a public library system, but we've, for several years have worked with the community, collecting a lot of particularly oral histories, but more recently, more documents, more things that help to document the history of a community lost. A lot of what was lost when a lot of highways came through, as they tore down some of the communities that existed just for African Americans when they were not included or were not allowed to, you know, stay in hotels or go to restaurants. So they had everything, they had all of their own. So my question gets back to, we're in a situation where they want to give us everything as opposed to like trying to hold on to it. And I kind of get it because, you know, it takes money to preserve or hold on to, but we're not really set up for that. So as we have a general collection development plan, and I'm working on a section that deals specifically with digitization of, like community materials. And I was just wondering, do you have guidelines? Because you just spoke of a collection development plan, like, what you will and will not take. Because if you open the gates, everybody, at least here, they're just going to want to give you everything. So I'm working through how to put into a plan of what we can do. And basically what I'm thinking is we're willing to take it, digitize it, record it, and then give it back. But we always run into situations, usually political, where somebody has this, collection they want the library to take, and we take it. So just, I guess my question is, do you have some guidelines that you work with on what you will or will not take from the community, or do you just take everything?
Right, that's a good question. I feel like we encountered this with our San Antonio folks. Now, they are a community archive, but we really encourage them to put an appraisal plan in place. Like, they couldn't really deal with like oil paintings that, someone wanted to offer or even like the quantity of things, the number of copies. I think there are a lot of examples of like appraisal policies, like what's in and what's out. And I think this is also about the whole kind of equity in the relationship, because I do think that sometimes folks think the libraries can do anything all the time and have unlimited capacity. And that's just not true. And I think it helps, especially if you take it, it's not community service. Like, it's not that we're going to give you everything that you need or everything that you want all the time. So being able to articulate the constraints and encouraging them to think about the best stuff or the most important thing that you can make sure you preserve well, but some of that other stuff might just have to like go back or find another way to be preserved. I think you should feel empowered to draw some lines around what you'll take. But I think maybe on our website, there might be some collection development and some appraisal. If you search appraisal on our CDAT website, that might reveal some stuff. It's the,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's like, I'll put it on the screen. Whatever, I'll share it. It's on one of the slides.
Oh, you can go back. Oh, it's not. You got it?
Oops. Oh, I think oh, there you go. There we go. Cool. This one, blogs.lib.unc.
You have a question in the room?
Hi, I was echoing what Jamie said. Thank you so much for your presentation and all the anecdotal things. It really reminds me of, so I'm from FIU and I work with Jamie right now on a project to build capacity at community-based archives around Miami-Dade and Broward. Coming from one now, and you're sitting in one as well. What really struck me the most in the presentation was this idea of, like, you know, tailoring the deliverables to each partner. That's something that I know that myself and our team down at FIU have been thinking about, because in our current grant project, we have 8 community partners, and deliverables, you know, the way they're approaching the grant is different, but the deliverables the same. So all of them, you know, contribute 10 to 12 oral histories that are stored on FIU's digital repository, which is deep in there. And we give them space if they want to, like, put additional materials on there. But, you know, as we go on in this grant, all of our partners are very diverse, at very different stages of some, you know, like when we're sitting in our link of been doing digitization for a long time, and others are really just starting. And then there are some that, you know, the digital, doing digitization is nice, and collecting oral histories is nice, but sometimes it seems like it's not fitting their immediate needs. A lot of these institutions are coming out of the COVID era. So I'm just curious, while you tailor the deliverables to each partner, which I assume is, you know, based on, you know, extensive conversations, was there a uniform deliverable that kind of linked them together, and like, or even like, you know, on the UNC side, was the deliverable primarily this web-based toolkit, or I might have missed this because I came in late. Do they have content posted on UNC's repository, or how? What is the link?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about this in a couple ways. So for our pilot partners, like the 4 big communities, they were definitely on a spectrum. So 2 of them actually have traditional collections at UNC, and they add to it on a periodic basis. The other 2 are very post-custodial. So their plan, so one is an independent archive. SACAM does really well in San Antonio, but the historically Black towns and settlements, like, is different for all of them. Some work with in terms of where the stuff is, it's different for all of them. For our seedlings, we did do a Mecca exhibit where we like showcased something from their project. And so that is a part of UNC's digital exhibitions. So yeah, that's an example, but I do take your point about the best way to tailor a deliverable in a way that like shows that these communities are a part of the same project. Because if they're too unique, then it's like, you know, what is it? So I don't know, maybe we can talk more about that.
We have another question from the chat. This was such a great presentation, thank you. From your discussion of budget as morality, might you be able to speak about very well-resourced institutions acquiring grants to do this work as opposed to the institutions paying for this themselves, especially if this work is prioritized or viewed as reparative work?
That's like big birds taking all the worms. That's what that is. No, that's interesting. I was just pulling up the blog so I could reference some of the points that we made in this budget as morality, but I feel like funders are doing major work around that exact discrepancy, and how do you lower the bar so that you don't have to have a whole office of sponsored research and like an accountant on your team to actually qualify for a grant. And so, you know, especially the folks at Mellon I've been in touch with, and they're always trying to help me or asking me to identify smaller organizations that could apply for their grants. But I did want to share, there's a few resources that really get at this. This Architecting Sustainable Futures, have you seen that? This is from Burgess Jules, Exploring Funding Models in Community-Based Archives. It's a report. It's related to some of the symposiums that these community archives were hosting in like the late 2016, 2017. So yeah, there's bigger brains than mine working on how to distribute money better. I know another thing is like, historically, these library grants have always been about like access and digitization, but that isn't always what communities need. Like they need a hole fixed in the wall. And so how do you get like library money for like infrastructure? But of course, there's always more to do, like pushing the envelope on these things. So trying to imagine what the need is, what the labor is, and the best funding source, and working collaboratively. I think that's kind of where the field is going. But yeah, I think that's an important point to make because we're not there yet.
Can you name the thing you were talking about, Kim?
It's called Architecting Sustainable Futures.
Okay, Architecting Sustainable Futures. We'll share any relevant links with the recording and email all participants what those links are as well.
I just wanted to jump in and say that there's an executive order, presidential executive order on advancing racial equity to support underserved communities, and NEH has developed an equity action plan that does some of that. So that the idea is to be more proactive and going to communities that don't normally apply for the NEH grants, and trying to engage those communities, and also simplifying the application process, as you mentioned, because that could be, you know, it takes a whole team of folks to get through a federal grant application. And so I think some of the larger grant agencies that you mentioned are really trying to rectify that.
Yeah, I feel like one of your sessions from the Wisconsin folks were like trying to develop these toolkits for grant making. So.
Recollection in Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Yep. We just happened a few weeks ago.
Yeah, we have had two recent presentations related to principles of community engagement. One was in June from Recollection Wisconsin folks, and we had one on Tuesday as well. The first one is available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to go back and watch that. The second one will be made available next week along with this recording as well. And we have another question in the room? No? Okay. If anyone has questions from our virtual audience, please feel free to either put those in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask your question if you prefer to do that.
I just wanted to respond back to, I think it was Renelda. I heard her voice. I wanted to go back and talking to people who sometimes consult with me about collections that they would like to find a home for, but maybe perhaps we're not the best place for that. You know, sometimes I'll reach out to some of our local networks, like the Software Archives Collective or our SFA, Society for Archivists, to see if there are other archives that make sense for those collections. I'm sure that they want to give the collection to your public library because they have an affinity with that library, but perhaps they might, you know, appreciate a recommendation for a place that you feel is reputable and will do justice to that collection as well. So it doesn't have to be just like a no, sorry, but maybe it's like a no, but maybe this is like another alternative.
Yeah, I agree. And SSDN is also happy to help you find other partners that might be willing to provide additional services. So if you want to do the digitization work, but are looking for an organization to house that material, we can help you make those connections too. Since we do talk to a lot of people all over the state. So that's also an option. If you want to reach out to us, we can help connect you to the right people. We don't have any questions coming in right now. So we'll give our online folks a few more minutes if you have any questions that you want to put into the chat or to raise your hand. Otherwise, if you don't have any additional questions, we'd like to thank our presenter for today, Chaitra Powell. And we would like to thank you for joining us today for our first hybrid event. Please give us feedback. We'll be sending you a survey. So let us know what your thoughts were and how we can improve. So thank you so much for attending today.